morning, everyone. So thank you for your patience. We were just making sure that everyone had joined the session safely. We would love to welcome you this morning for this webinar on such an important and topical issue, value for money and pensions. I'm really excited to be here and that you can join us today. So, as I said, we're here to talk about value for money and particularly the open consultation. This is a joint effort between TPR, FCA and DWP. It's a really critical time that we're talking about this, as the proposals are currently open for consultation. And this session is really an opportunity to help understand and shape them. So we are really lucky to have the chair of the pensions regulator, Sarah Smart, with us today. She's been a long proponent of value for money and pensions, and what she's going to do is she's going to give us insights into the work and future framework. For those of you that wouldn't know who Sarah is, which seems unlikely, but Sarah was appointed the chair of the pensions regulator in June 21, and she's really an experienced non-exec director and independent trustee of various different things. Some of the sort of highlights, I think, really were that she has been the chair of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee of TPR from 2016 to 2021. And also she has really years and years worth of experience in a variety of different roles as a trustee, and also sort of helping various pension funds and schemes in all sorts of different capacities. So really very familiar face, and obviously absolutely delighted that as the chair of the pensions regulator, she's here with us to talk to us about the open consultation. So she is here to focus on value for money, and she is going to focus the session with a bit of a sort of kick-off of opening remarks. Then we're going to talk through some of the detail of the proposals, which hopefully will help unpick some of the intricacies, and also will help unpick what's currently being considered in the framework design. And then we'll spend all of the remaining time discussing questions directly from you. That's the audience. So please ask them throughout the session. We'll cover as many as we possibly can in the time available. But really, without further ado, Sarah, I'd like to hand over to you so that you can take us through your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alicia, and good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here with you this morning, and I'm really happy that so many of you have been able to join us for this webinar. As Alicia said in her just opening remarks, value for money is something I've felt very passionately about for many years. People have probably heard me banging on about it before. So I'm really glad that we've got to this point, and delivering value for money throughout the DC system is a major priority for TPR, for DWP and for FCA, but we all recognise that we can only do it with your help. So I'm really delighted to have you here at this webinar and talking about it. I think we're probably all pretty familiar with TPR's role as a regulator in protecting consumers. But another key role for us is also to enable a properly functioning competitive market. And that's perhaps not always something that's front of mind when people think of TPR. And maybe that's because the nature of competition and the assessment of value for money can seem perhaps easier in other markets when the concept of value for money is more easily accessible. If we think of broadband, for example, so important for connecting me with you today, the questions I can ask myself when considering value for money is my broadband working? Is it giving me the download speeds that I was told it would give me? Am I being charged what I was told I would be charged? Immediately accessible concept of value for money to me as a consumer. For defined contribution pensions, however, I think the concept of value for money is not so easily accessible. And often the final outcome of a lifetime of savings isn't actually understood until perhaps 30 years down the line. And by then let's face it, it's really too late to discover that the product you've been using hasn't been delivering what you expected of it. In pensions, we know we've seen a revolution over the last decade as millions more people are now saving into defined contribution pensions, thanks to the success of auto enrollment, and also thanks to many of you in this room who will have helped to lay the foundations on which we've begun to build a nation of savers. But the fact that people are saving isn't enough. as a regulator and as an industry, we need to be certain that savers' hard-earned cash is working really as hard as it can, and that all savers are receiving value for money. And so that's why, together with our partners at DWP and at the FCA, we've launched this consultation, which is really looking to deliver a consistent and coherent framework for value for money in DC pensions. I'm sure you'll all recall, and you'll all have read it, no doubt, and responded, I'm sure, the discussion paper that preceded this. And the responses we received to that discussion paper all acknowledged the critical importance of ensuring that pension savers get value for money, but also acknowledged the real difficulty of doing this in a meaningful way. But just because our view is that just because something is difficult doesn't mean we should shy away from doing it. And now really is the time to make sure that we grasp this challenge and really bring it to reality. Because DC savers rely on the pension system working as best it can over the lifetime of their saving. You'll hear us say perhaps time and time again, every penny counts, and it really does. We know, however, that the vast majority of savers don't choose necessarily to be in the pension scheme and don't engage with it. The system is effectively built and driven by inertia, and that's part of the beauty of it and part of the thing that really keeps savers in and helps them. But in a system where savers don't actively select the service or the product that they're using, then it's incumbent on those who are governing that system or that product to ensure that savers receive value for money by default. So our consultation has better outcomes for savers as its central objective. And what we're looking to do is to define the data that DC schemes will have to disclose going forward to demonstrate that these objectives, these good outcomes, are being achieved. What we know at the moment is that we have information asymmetries, where some schemes are able either themselves or through consultancy support to have access to data to enable them to see how they measure up to other schemes. But many don't, and not many are doing things in the same way as others. So there's no consistency or comparability. There's a real hodgepodge of approaches to assessing what value for the saver it really is. And of course, the outcome of that is there's a real risk to savers that they could be invested and their money could be invested in poorly performing schemes. So in our view, in a properly functioning market, those who are making decisions on behalf of the savers, those who are responsible for driving value, primarily the trustees, they need to have the tools available to them to enable them to have a real laser-like focus on delivering good pensions outcomes. So we're determined through this framework to provide trustees, advisors, and employers with the data which allows increased comparability, transparency, and competition across DC pension schemes. We want to help schemes shift their focus from purely cost, and we know at the moment, we've talked about it a lot of time, that cost really is the main focus, costs and charges. We want to shift that focus from cost to a more considered and holistic assessment of value for money. So our proposals would require DC schemes to provide standard metrics across 3 areas: investment performance, costs and charges, still there, still very important, and services. And so that would bring a consistent approach to measurement and make sure there's comparability across providers and across schemes. What then happens? Well, underperforming schemes would be required to take action to improve the value they provide to savers or consolidate where this is in savers' best interests. And if not, then they'll face regulatory action. Simples. Speaking in these terms, I know makes solving the challenges we face sound simple, but we do acknowledge, we all know pensions are complex. And so our responsibility is to straddle that line between the theoretical, what looks really good on paper, and the practical, what we and the industry can actually achieve together if we're going to deliver the data sets that enable real change in the market real change for savers. So we're working with our partners at DWP and FCA to get this right across both sides of the market. And hopefully by working seamlessly together as one regulatory family, but also in collaboration with the industry, your input is so important. We can then deliver the consistent regulation and outcomes that the public expect. We don't pretend to have all the answers now. This really is a genuine consultation, and there's a number of areas of the consultation where we propose options and how we may go forward, but we're really asking for your input as to what will be both practical and really help assess those good outcomes for savers. So I really encourage everyone here, you've signed up for the webinar, so you must be enthused and keen. I really encourage you all to engage with this open public consultation, help shape our thoughts and really help us to deliver pensions that work for everyone. And very happy to take questions and get into the discussion, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you. And I was, as we were going, scribbling down there because some really helpful language, I think, for the rest of the discussion, particularly around sort of holistic measures, which I know is an area of lots of interest for a lot of people. Also, the theoretical and the practical, I thought that was a really interesting way of describing it. I wonder whether we sort of might start there, actually, just a little bit in terms of sort of theory and also scope. So from reading all of the work, as you mentioned, there's sort of multiple bites of the cherry here. This is the sort of second or third time some of these issues are being discussed more generally. Some of the rationale appears to be that we start our interventions in the place where the most savers are. So, you know, the AE market predominantly, and that includes many very large AE schemes, such as Master Trust, that, as you mentioned, are already undertaking quite a lot of quite detailed analytical value assessment work, sometimes alone, sometimes supported. And also we obviously have charge caps and a strong authorization regime and whatnot in the Master Trust market, particularly as an example. So it seems to make sense, in a sense, to start with where many of the savers are. But then also there's the question of the more what I would call retail market, which is where maybe not the balance of savers are, but where there don't seem to be exactly the same protections. So you could make an argument theoretically that you might wish to start there. So I'm just interested in that sort of why have you started where you've started, and you know, let's talk about that a little bit, and maybe in the context of that theory and practice point too.
Sure. Now I might not get the phrase exactly right, but something is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or something like that. You know, there's a massive pensions saving industry out there, and we could seek to put in place a framework that encompasses all of that. But perhaps we would take so long doing that to get off the ground and perfecting it that it would never happen. As you've already said, you know, we've had a few bites at the cherry at this problem before, and that came out in our discussion paper. You know, this is a knotty, tricky problem. And so let's try and eat the elephant perhaps in a few different bites. So it's not just auto-enrollment schemes that are in scope at the moment. It's workplace default arrangements. So that's automatic enrollment and legacy schemes. And the reason we're looking at that first and then the more retail element later is that I think there's good reasonable evidence to show that retail savers can be slightly more engaged. We know in the workplace area, savers are defaulted into pension schemes. Many of them are not even aware they're in their scheme. So it's really important there, where there's that lack of engagement, that inertia, to make sure that the schemes they're defaulted into are really providing that value for money. Not ignoring retail savers, value for money for retail savers is really important as well. And so the intention is for the approach to be phased, that once we've got it in place for workplace default arrangements, it'll then roll out to workplace self-select options, non-workplace pensions, and also pensions in decumulation. We're very keen to hear people's views on this, but I think with that thought in mind, let's not set ourselves such a massive mountain before we do anything that we don't actually start and do anything. We've got to get cracking on this. It's been too long since we've really tackled it.
Thank you, Sarah. And that sounds like a first point of note for everyone in the audience that this is an area that Sarah and her team are very interested in hearing about. So let's take a think about that scope point. I think one of the questions, I'm going to tie in one of the questions that we've had in already about what sort of regulatory action could TPR take. You mentioned that, you know, you might take action where bad outcomes are found, but I guess also I'm interested in whether that attention will be focused perhaps predominantly on those schemes that need to improve, or whether it would be focused just more generally on consolidation, for example. You know, what sort of actions would TPR take, and how would that play through as far as you see it?
So one of the objectives of this framework is that it will give us more scope to take action where schemes are not doing what they're supposed to be doing or delivering value for money. So still to be completely nailed down exactly, what the framework looks like, and then what the action is taken as a result of that. But if schemes are not engaging with that at all, and we've seen that in some of the earlier iterations in terms of value for member assessments and things like that for under 100 million, you know, if schemes aren't engaging at all, then that gives us a clear regulatory imperative in our ideal world to say to those schemes, you either need to wind up or to consolidate. And we have clear regulatory ability to do that. Then I think when you move up a scale and you've kind of got everyone who's getting over the bar, if you like, it's not just about we're getting over the bar, we've ticked the box, that's fine, go on. It's then about that competition between those schemes that have got themselves at a certain level. And then we want to make sure we have the ability to look at how the schemes are performing and where in a comparable way, and where it is clear that schemes either aren't delivering value for money or aren't performing nearly as well as others in the universe, that we can take action with them, ideally in collaboration with them first. You know, our supervision approach over the last 5 years has shown how ideally, we want to enable schemes that are trying to do the right thing to move forward and use this data to help them do that. But if schemes are showing themselves not to be wanting to take the appropriate action, then we can take regulatory action for that.
Thank you, Sarah. And then it seems remiss not to then talk about what good looks like. So we've talked a little bit about what bad looks like there, but what does good look like to you? And in a hard question, let's say in 2 years' time or in 5 years' time, what do you think? What will look like good progress to you?
Okay, so 2 years, as we all know, is not that long in the pensions market. So I think the framework's not going to come in overnight. So in 2 years, probably a good outcome is that there's consensus, that we all agree on the disclosures and the assessments that we're looking to for everyone to deliver, and that legislation is in place to enact that. So then there's certainty as to where we're going and people can move forward for that. I mean, you say that I've talked about a bad outcome. I mean, bad outcome in terms of schemes, but bad outcome in terms of policy, regulatory policy for me is that the industry spends lots and lots of money complying with the regulation that we've put in place, and that doesn't actually deliver anything for savers. You know, that for me is the really bad outcome. So this can't be a tick box exercise. It has to drive real change in the market for us to be satisfied. So in the long term, perhaps try to say, you know, a good outcome is that all savers receive value for money for their pensions. What does that really look like? Get under the skin of that. I think it means that there's data being produced and that can be assessed and compared, which identifies those poor performers and encourages them either to drastically improve or to get out of the market. So that looks like, for me, competition between schemes based on value for money. Advisors talking about value for money, not just talking about cost, and using that as an integral part of their advice. and us as a regulator having the ability to take action against those schemes that aren't delivering for value for money. And I think another important thing to say actually about a good outcome is that there's consistency across how TPR and the FCA are delivering this framework. You know, we've often had that as a kind of bugbear of the industry, particularly those organisations that are operating in both regulatory environments. I think it's really important for us in this one to make sure there's a consistency in approach and framework so that those organisations don't have to duplicate their work.
Thank you, and that's very interesting, that sort of pragmatism, I guess, and also interplay between other requirements, and I just wanted to pause on that for a second, at least in part because we've had a specific question about ESG factors, which I know we were going to plan to come on to, but we might take now anyway. But also just more generally, there's a couple of questions about investment measurement. So, you know, is it net of fees? How are we going to mitigate against the risk of herding? You know, how do we take account of costs and charges? There are a lot of themes about this sort of holistic measurement of different measures and also taking account of existing disclosure. So I don't know whether we turn to that now, and if you could just talk a little bit about how you see sort of parallel disclosures feeding into this framework, for example, things like TCFD or chair's statement, but also just more generally how the different elements might be taken account of in the right way.
Okay, let me make sure I've understood your question. I'll attack the first bit of it first,
of course,
which is kind of how do all the different requirements feed in. So, you know, I think at the moment we've got initiatives like TCFD statement, implementation statement, chair statements, all of which are seeking to do slightly different things, but which overlap potentially a bit on what this framework is looking to do as well. There is a section in the consultation asking for people's views specifically on the chair statement, but I think also, you know, very keen to hear your views on where you think there are other areas that where schemes are required to provide information that may then not be required once this framework is fully in place. It's absolutely not our intention to require schemes to spend double the money providing the same bits of information in two different parts. So I'm really keen to hear views on that. But remember also that this framework at the moment is just seeking to inform what we would call the more professional or informed audience, so schemes, trustees, advisors, employers. It's not seeking to inform savers, and we do recognise that as a requirement in due course, particularly when the dashboard is all up and running, that savers will be wanting to make choices about where they potentially consolidate their own pots and what they do with their money going forward. So there's lots of things, again, taking the elephant in different bites. So we need to think about down the line about what's the information the saver needs, different to the information that the more professional audience needs for them to make their choices about their own pots, as opposed to those who are charged with looking after those pots for them making their choices. I think that's the first bit of the question. What about, I can't formulate the second bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me try again, because I've tried to combine a couple of different questions. So let's take them in turn rather than combining them. So I think the first question is a pretty straightforward question about, is investment net of fees? So and how is that planned to be measured?
So there's quite a lot of detail again in the consultation about how the proposals around the fees that we're taking out. So it's net of all costs and charges, and some different areas that we're asking for or proposing that there's information on that. So please do encourage you to read it. I don't have the exact detail right at my fingertips at the moment, but I can open it just here if you want to, but it's probably more efficient for people to read it. And I'm glad that you're really interested in that. But yes, net of all fees, and also where employers are actually paying for fees on behalf of members, then we're wanting to get disclosure on that as well, because that can often kind of muddy the waters a little bit as to exactly what the value for money is and the success of investment strategies and stuff, where employers are paying for charges. So there's suggestions on that as well.
Thank you. And then there's sort of the second component was really about the risk of herding. So you've sort of mentioned the costs and charges being taken account of in investment and also separately. But there are some factors, for example, and another question about the additional cost of ESG flavoured investment, for example, that takes additional resource and that would be taken account of as part of the metrics, presumably, and that would be purposeful and sort of with intent that they're taken account of. Is that right? Is that we've sort of understood that correctly?
So let me can I do herding first?
Of course.
So on herding, I think, it's absolutely a key objective for us that there is differentiation in the market and products available that meet the needs for different savers and for different employers when they're looking for schemes for their members. So it's not a good outcome for us if we end up with lots of schemes or all the schemes doing all the same thing. And for example, when we were devising the master trust regime, one thing we clearly discussed and we have as a consideration within the regulator is to check back from time to time as to how providers are positioning themselves, what they're offering, and to make sure there is still differentiation and appropriate competition in the market that gives choice to employers and choice to savers. So that remains a key function going forwards, and it would be a bad outcome for us if this just drove everybody to do exactly the same thing, because there are lots of different groups of savers out there, different groups of employers who have different requirements, and we expect providers to want to compete in different ways to attract those different audiences. So it's one thing we'll be keeping an eye on. I believe the competitive market is such that it will mitigate against that, but we'll be keeping an eye on it. We're certainly aware of that as a potential consequence. In terms of then ESG and other factors, one of the things that we're looking at in the framework is there's the comparison of different timeframes of historical investment returns and also projections of future investment returns. And when we look at the risk of climate and other sort of ESG type risks, a lot of the decisions around that, as we know, are based on an expectation of the future and how the future will be different to the past. And the past, often doesn't inform us about some of these risks that haven't materialized to the extent that we think they are going to in the future. So the design of the framework is absolutely intended to enable and encourage schemes to look to those risks that they think will make a material impact on savers' outcomes in the future, and design for those in a way that's consistent with requirements of ESG and TCFD and all the other initiatives in that area.
Thank you, Sarah. And you've managed to answer another question inadvertently that was about the sort of forward and backward looking factors. So I think we've covered that as well in your answer there. So thank you very much. I'm just going to take us on a slightly different track for a second, because we've sort of mentioned you've mentioned disclosure a couple of times, and also the sort of interaction between professional audiences and saver audiences and potentially other audiences, I guess. One of the questions that we've had in is about whether you do see in the end consumers taking a decision or making decisions about consolidation, and you also have mentioned a couple of times sort of competition. Who's the audience, or who are the schemes catering for in your view? Is it the consumer in the end, or is it the consumer almost as the first port of call, or is it the employer or someone else? I think that would be quite interesting to get into, because I think it relates again to your role as a regulator in this space, and how do you see yourselves taking forward and sort of supporting the framework in the future?
Yeah. So I think what we all know about communication is you have to communicate in a way that's relevant for the different audiences and for the purpose that those audiences are going to make use of the communication. So potentially, we've made, as an industry, we've made some errors in the past from seeking to use the same communication to reach too many different audiences and too many different things. And this framework clearly at this stage is to inform trustees, providers, employers, advisors about how schemes are doing, providing value for money and good, and enabling them to provide good outcomes for savers. Now, this is, and the advisors bit is very important because we know that employers make decisions often on the basis of with help from advisors, and what advisors say and take into account can really drive how providers behave. So they're important, but that's, and we talked about the fact that it's inertia. Many savers are not engaged when these decisions are being made about what scheme to use. So they're often, if they get engaged at all, are engaged at a different part in the cycle, and so that could be different information that they are using at that point in time. And so I think there's going to, once the dashboard is up and running, we already see savers making choices, but transferring, very engaged savers making choices about transferring their pots, about what they're doing to accumulation. There's not necessarily a huge amount of options out there for them, and not necessarily accessible or cost-effective advice to help them consider those options. And as the DC pots and savings for those who've been auto-enrolled grow and grow, then as an industry, that's something we will need to put our minds to and address. But there's potentially a real difference in the information that savers will want to help them make those decisions at specific points in time than the information that that trustees and employers and advisors need at a different point in time to help them make a slightly different decision.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you some timeline questions because we've had a couple in. I think you've already partially answered this, but you've also just mentioned accumulation, so I have to jump on it since you've mentioned it.
When are we going to do it?
When are you going to do accumulation? And sort of more generally, when do you see phase 2, and what does that look like? Because that could be really, really critical for some of those savers sort of in the system right now, and trying to access their pension. So when do you see this stuff going live?
Well, this stuff, the consultation will close at the end of March, I believe it is, and then it'll work its way through the system. And I imagine that everyone will potentially be used to me saying, I can't completely dictate that timetable, and we will be working closely with the DWP and the Minister to make that happen as soon as possible. I hope we will have lots and lots and lots of responses that we will have to carefully consider to construct the right regulations that will then have to go through Parliament, and then we'll have to provide our regulatory sort of framework on the back of that. So as I said, it doesn't immediately happen. I'm delighted though that everyone wants to know when step 2 will happen, because that means that they are completely bought into step 1 and have already written their response to the consultation, and they're champing at the bit for the next bit. So I can't give any certain timeline on that, I'm afraid, Alicia, but we will let's get this in first. Let's make it happen, and let's make it good. And then let's look at where we need to go from there.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot in the past at the PLSA in general is learning from good experiences from other jurisdictions. And you mentioned there, taking the right amount of time to consider responses and to consider factors. Just interested, I know I'm going to use a sort of buzz bingo phrase. I'm going to mention it. I'm going to mention Australia. The question that's come in hasn't specifically mentioned Australia. It said other DC markets globally, but I'm going to mention Australia. What can we learn from there, and what have you already learned? And do you see that as a sort of rich seam of information for this next phase before going live?
So we our system is not exactly the same as the Australian system. So we're not going to just look at what happens in Australia and go, yeah, let's do everything that's over there. They've solved the problem for us, we'll do it. But absolutely, I am a massive fan. Anyone who's worked with me before, and all of my colleagues at TPR will tell you that, I'm a massive fan of looking at what others have done. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said, learn from other people's mistakes, because life is too short to make them all yourself. So that's a thing that I'm very keen to live by. So I think the Australian system recently, the changes that they've put in since 2021, when the regulator kind of set a benchmark test that all schemes had to meet. Now, I think prior to that happening, there were quite a lot of members in schemes that weren't meeting that test, and that includes investment performance. It's not just costs and charges. And then since 2021, I think now 96% of members are in schemes that are outperforming that kind of benchmark test as set by the regulator. So there are differences in the system in Australia from what's being proposed in the framework, but I think it clearly shows us that where a clear framework is in place and where there is comparability, then it does drive change in the market. And so that's a very encouraging precedent for us. So absolutely, we look at what's happening in other jurisdictions and seek to learn from that.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I've got another few questions on the theme of communication. So really focusing actually mostly on saver communication. So I guess outcomes, to summarize, outcomes of value assessments to savers, and also making sure that savers take informed choices as a result of those assessments where possible. Now, again, I think you've covered this mostly by talking about audience, but I guess there is still a residual risk there in terms of saver activities. How are you looking at that?
So I think one thing to say as prelude to this is for the last sort of year and a bit, we've had some panels operating within TPR, a sort of practitioner panel, employers panel, and a savers panel. Now, at the moment, that savers panel is populated with kind of representative groups on behalf of savers, but we're really keen to hear from savers about what information they need to help them make good decisions. And often the savers that we actually, I think, need to hear from is those savers who aren't engaged, who don't know anything about pensions. So we're really open to suggestions as we go through, and it's perhaps not completely relevant for this consultation, as I said, because this audience is not specifically for savers, but we are really keen to hear from those in the industry who talk to savers a lot as to how we can effectively understand from a really broad range of individuals in different circumstances what information they need from the industry, and whether they're getting it, and whether there is regulatory action potentially that is needed to help savers make the decisions that they want. Decision making is a core part of our 15-year strategy. At the moment we're focusing on this bit, we may well need in due course to move to looking at the information that savers are using, the decisions they're making, and how whether we as a regulator need to be more active in making sure that they're getting the information that they need. I think we'll get a better view of that once dashboard is in place and we understand what is happening as a result of that. But it's absolutely an area that we are keeping an eye on, want to understand going forwards how things are progressing as savers realise they've got this pot that they never put them, a pension scheme they never put themselves into. They've got a pot, crikey, I want to do something good with this now. But we're absolutely aware that there's going to be many people listening to this webinar and out there who will be able to help us understand exactly what savers need.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And just more generally, the sort of value reporting standards, you've mentioned your intent to keep them as comparable and consistent as possible, and that being a sort of key theme. And there are some factors, maybe such as member communications actually, that are more qualitatively assessed potentially, or governance maybe, and others that are more quantitatively assessed. Sort of traditionally, or well, not even really traditionally, just I guess just sort of logically. So how do you see that that sort of interplay working? Because on the one hand, making it as consistent as possible, but then on the other hand, sort of trying to take account of real differences where they occur. How do you see schemes doing that, you doing that, other advisors doing that, and do you expect to be particular about that, or are you
in terms of the kind of more qualitative areas.
Yeah, the more qualitative areas particularly. I mean, quant is sort of, 4 = 4, but, if it's great equals fantastic, what does that mean? How are we supposed to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, so far we've tried to outline a sort of simple step-by-step process for the assessment of value for money based on quantifiable measures. And I think this is to try and move people away from the overly subjective assessments that can be made, but then don't really enable any transparency or comparability. So, it's a truism, perhaps, to say good governance, delivers better outcomes. Well, does it? How do we measure it? How can we really say that is happening? So I think our first step is to really focus on quantifiable outcomes. But we do know that there are areas that providers have designed their product on based on their understanding, and schemes and many schemes based on their understanding of what their requirement for the members are, what's right for their members. So we'd welcome views on how that potentially might work, and we might be able to incorporate some of that either now or in the future as essential data points. But I think we're really, first of all, we really need to focus on the quantifiable, because we've for too long, I think, wrapped ourselves in the cozy blanket of, well, I do this, therefore it must deliver a good outcome, but I can't really pin down exactly whether it does or not. I mean, many of you'll know I come from my background in the investment world, and something we hear so often is in investment is, well, we're paying X% more fees for this manager because they will deliver great performance. And that's the expectation at the beginning, but it's not necessarily the reality at the end. And so the extra money that is being spent on stuff that is supposed to provide better outcomes, we need to understand whether it really is providing better outcomes or not.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We are rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to, in an unusual step, ask you in a second if there's anything else that you want to say to us. But I'll just sort of wrap up, and then I'll come back to you. So you've got a bit of pre-warning. But we are really running out of time. We've had loads of questions. I've done my absolute best. I think I've achieved about half the questions asked in to ask you there, Sarah. But
would you be able to capture the questions and send them to us, Alicia, because obviously that in itself is a good response, partial response to the consultation.
Absolutely. I was going to say a similar thing. So, if people feel that they haven't had their question answered, and for which apologies, mail me or mail someone in the team, and we'll make sure that we've shared them across. Also, where we have answered your question, or where Sarah's answered a question and you have a reaction or a comment or something, please do share it. Don't keep it to yourself. This is really an opportunity to discuss these open issues and to hear more ideas and feed them in. The consultation itself runs until the end of March, but further conversations will be ongoing for a while, I would expect, because there's so much in there. So please do get in touch. Thank you all, like I say, for all of your great questions. Thanks for the team behind the scenes who were helping me a little bit, because we had such a volume of questions that it was difficult to balance. And we will obviously, this was recorded, so we will circulate the slides. Anyone that wants to watch it back or share it with a colleague, please do. Again, share your thoughts as a reaction to that. Sarah, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to say, sort of as that we didn't cover, that you were expecting us to cover before I close fully.
No, not really. I think there's one anonymous comment on here, I think, which I'll pick on just because it's helpful to do that. And it's the anonymous person saying, wouldn't it be easier just to measure the outcomes that savers get and see whether they're any good, rather than measure kind of performance and measures? And yes, it is all about outcomes, but as I said at the beginning, we don't know the outcome until the end of the process, and by then it's too late. You can't say, my phone's not working, I'm going to give it back and get another phone. It's like, my 30 years of savings haven't worked, what are you going to do for me now? So it's really difficult to understand as we're going through the journey whether something's working or not and it's going to deliver a good outcome. But let's all work together, I think, in trying to make a reality of a framework that can help us get there. It's not going to be perfect. There'll be people who want us to do more, who want us to speak to savers, who want us to be more precise actually in the quantifiable figures we're getting, which would just be too much of a burden on industry. So we're trying to tread a really fine line here between something that works, it's not too burdensome on industry, and actually provides meaningful information that really drives value for money. That's very difficult. Those comments have been made before, but it's not impossible. And I'm sure that if we all work together, then we can make it happen. So I really look forward to receiving your responses to the consultation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you. So thank you to Sarah for taking the time to speak to us. If you would like to engage with this topic anymore, there's actually a PLSA survey out at the moment, for example, with membership. So please do respond to that. Please get in contact with Sarah's team, get in contact with us, and there'll be lots more opportunities to discuss this over the next sort of period. So please do engage with it. Just to let you know also, please do complete the feedback for us. It really helps us to set these sessions up in the best way that's the most helpful for you. So do fill in the feedback for us. For example, one of Sarah's colleagues is coming in a couple of weeks' time towards the end of March to talk about code, TPR code. So, you know, let us know how you feel this session went, and we can feed that back. But nothing more from me. We've overrun. It's always the way. We've overrun. Thank you, Sarah, again. Thank you all for everyone's attention. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.